Hello friends, welcome to my channel Reddit Stories. I invite you to take a walk with me along the waterfront and listen to a new and interesting story. Let's go.
What happens when a man comes home early and finds the strangest things in his own bathroom? This is that story.
I came home early and walked in the bathroom. A stranger's razor, a stranger's toothbrush, and my wife, stuttering for the first time in 14 years. I didn't scream. I didn't ask twice. I just smiled, walked out, and started digging. What I found buried under our marriage made the razor look innocent. My name is Jack Harrington. I'm 43 years old. I've been married to Luna for 14 years. We have 2 kids, Caleb, who's 13 and already thinks he knows everything, and Aurora, 9 years old, who still leaves drawings on my desk when she thinks I'm sad. I built everything I have from nothing. Grew up in a working-class family in Murfreesboro, put myself through college, clawed my way up the ladder at 3 different companies before landing at Meridian Media. I'm not a man who quits. That matters for this story. It was a Thursday in late October. I'd left the office early, rare for me, but a client meeting had canceled last minute, and I had zero desire to sit through another round of budget revisions. I drove home with the windows down and the radio off, just thinking. Luna's car was in the driveway, which wasn't unusual. She managed a small interior design studio downtown and kept flexible hours. I came in through the side door off the garage. The house felt off the moment I stepped inside. Not loud off, quiet off. The particular silence of a house that's holding its breath. No music from the kitchen. No Luna calling out from wherever she was. Just stillness. I set my laptop bag on the bench and walked through the hallway. The bedroom door was open. I stepped in and immediately noticed the master bathroom door, slightly ajar, a thin line of light cutting across the floor. Luna was obsessive about that door. She always kept it closed. Always. I pushed it open. What I found didn't announce itself dramatically. There was no movie moment. It was just a collection of small, wrong things. A man's razor resting on the edge of the sink, black-handled, unfamiliar. A damp towel folded over the shower door that wasn't ours. And there, beside my toothbrush, a second one, angled as if it belonged there, as if it had always been there. My brain cataloged each item slowly, the way it does when something doesn't add up, and it's trying to find the innocent explanation first. I heard a step behind me. Luna stood in the bedroom doorway, still dressed, a careful expression on her face. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it. Something rehearsed. "You're home early," she said, her voice landing a half-second too late. I turned and looked at her without speaking. I watched her eyes move from me to the bathroom and back. "Whose are these?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Her lips parted, then closed, then parted again. "What do you mean?" "The razor, the toothbrush, the towel." I stepped aside so she had a full view. "Whose are they, Luna?" And that was the moment. She stood there in the doorway of our bedroom, the woman I had built 14 years of life with. And she stuttered. Not a word or two. Her whole composure stuttered. A visible hesitation, like a machine catching on something it wasn't supposed to catch on. "A friend," she finally managed. "He came by too. He needed to freshen up before an appointment." "He?" "Yes." Her chin lifted slightly, the way it always did when she was trying to project confidence she didn't have. "What friend?" A pause that lasted one beat too long. "Dwayne. You don't know him. He's a client." I nodded slowly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move toward her. I simply said, "All right," and walked back out of the bedroom, down the hallway, and out the side door. Behind me, I heard her call my name once. I didn't answer. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes in the driveway, hands on the wheel, engine off. Not spiraling, not falling apart, just thinking with a coldness I hadn't known I was capable of. I'd been here before in business. The moment you realize someone across the table is lying to you, and they don't know yet that you know. You don't react. You gather. You plan. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text to Grant Fowler. "Need to talk." Not urgent, but soon. Then I started the engine and drove. I drove for about an hour. No destination, no music, just the highway and the October dark closing in around me. When I finally pulled back into the driveway, Luna's bedroom light was off. I sat in the truck another 10 minutes, then went inside through the garage. I didn't go to the bedroom. I took the couch. Sleep didn't come for a long time. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, running the bathroom scene through my head on a loop. Not with rage, but with a kind of forensic detachment. The razor, the toothbrush, the way she'd said his name, Dwayne. Too quickly. Already prepared. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and went to my home office. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I opened the filing cabinet where we kept household documents, mortgage, insurance, tax returns. I pulled the folders out one by one, not hunting for anything specific, just moving. That's when I found the envelope. It had been tucked behind the insurance folder, which is why I'd never seen it. A plain white envelope with my name written on the outside in my father's handwriting. My father, Carl Harrington, had died 4 years ago, a heart attack at 68, 2 weeks before Christmas. I remembered going through his desk at the house in Murfreesboro, boxing things up. I must have packed this without opening it, and filed it away without realizing what it was. I sat down and opened it. It was 3 pages, handwritten on yellow legal paper, dated 14 months before he died. Jack, I've been meaning to write this for a while, and keep putting it off, the way men do with things that matter. So here it is. Your mother had an affair. 19 years into our marriage. I found out the way most men do, by accident, not by looking. I want to tell you what I did wrong, because you're my son, and I'd rather you learn from my mistakes than repeat them. What I did wrong was react. I confronted her the same night. I yelled. I gave her every advantage. She knew exactly what I knew, exactly how I felt, exactly how much she'd hurt me. She used all of it. By the time the dust settled, I had nothing left to negotiate with. I stayed, and I'm glad I stayed, but I stayed on her terms, not mine. That's the part that sat wrong for years. If something like this ever happens to you, and I hope it doesn't, don't react. Gather yourself first. Find out everything before you say anything. A man who controls his information controls the outcome. I love you, son. Be smarter than I was. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and set it on the desk. My father had been a quiet, practical man who never talked about feelings if he could avoid it. 3 pages of yellow legal paper was the most he'd ever said to me about anything personal, and he'd written it like a field manual. Don't react. Gather yourself first. Find out everything before you say anything. I pulled out my phone and texted Grant again. Tomorrow morning. Coffee. Early. Then I opened my banking app. I've been meaning to look at our joint savings account for weeks. Luna handled most of the household finances, which I'd always been fine with. She was organized, detail-oriented, better at that kind of thing than I was. I scrolled back through 6 months of transactions and almost missed it the first time. A recurring transfer, once a month, to an account I didn't recognize. Not huge, between $800 and $1,200 each time, but consistent. Every 3rd week of the month, like clockwork. I sat up straighter. I went back further. 12 months of transfers. 18 months. The account number was always the same. The memo line was always blank. I wrote the account number down on a notepad and stared at it. Luna ran the design studio. She had her own business account. We'd agreed early on that she'd keep her professional finances separate, which made sense at the time. But this transfer wasn't coming from her business account. It was coming from ours. From a joint account where my paychecks landed. I closed the app and sat in the dark for a while. In the morning, I was up before the kids. I made coffee, got Caleb and Aurora through their routines, dropped them at school without running into Luna, and drove straight to the diner on Belmont where Grant was already waiting with a cup halfway finished. Grant Fowler and I had known each other since our late 20s. He'd been my first mentor in the industry, a straight-talking operations director who'd seen everything twice. He listened without interrupting while I laid it out. The bathroom, the razor, Dwayne, the letter, the transfers. When I finished, he set down his cup. "How are you feeling?" "Focused," I told him. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, then let's talk about what you do next." He leaned forward. "You need someone who can trace that account, and you need a family attorney before she finds one. Whoever moves first sets the terms." "I know someone," I said. "Private investigator. Did work for a guy at Meridian last year." "Use him." Grant's voice was flat and certain. "And Jack, don't tip her off. Not yet. The second she knows you're building a case, everything gets harder." I nodded. I already knew that. My father had told me. 14 years too late for him, and just in time for me. I left the diner and made 2 calls from the parking lot. The first was to a private investigator named Derek Pollard. The second was to a family attorney downtown. The war hadn't started yet, but I was done waiting for her to find me. Derek Pollard operated out of a second-floor office above a tax prep shop on Nolensville Pike. No sign on the door, just a number. He was ex-Metro Police, early 50s, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. He shook my hand, poured 2 cups of bad coffee, and listened without taking a single note while I walked him through everything. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "You want to know who Dwayne Sloan is, where he comes from, and what his connection to your wife looks like on paper. And I want to know how far back it goes," I added. He nodded slowly. "Give me 72 hours for the first layer. I'll have more after that." He slid a single sheet across the desk, his rate, his terms, his confidentiality agreement. I signed it without haggling. Some things are worth paying for. I drove back to the office and spent the rest of the day functioning on autopilot. Meetings, emails, a pitch review for a new client in Memphis. I did all of it. Nobody noticed anything different. That was intentional. 3 days later, Pollard called me back to Nolensville Pike. He laid a manila folder on the desk and opened it without ceremony. Dwayne Sloan, 35, originally from Clarksville, worked as a freelance brand consultant, loosely defined, as far as Pollard could tell. 2 LLCs registered in Tennessee, 1 dissolved, 1 active. The active one had received irregular deposits over the past 18 months, several of which aligned in timing with the transfers from my joint account. I stared at that line for a long moment. "He's not just a guy she met," I said. "Doesn't look like it," Pollard replied. "The financial overlap goes back at least 20 months, which means this started well before you found those things in your bathroom." 20 months. I ran the math without meaning to. 20 months ago, Luna and I had celebrated our 13th anniversary at a restaurant downtown. She'd worn a green dress. We'd talked about taking the kids to Colorado the following summer. I kept my face still. How far back does their connection go? Before the money. Pollard turned a page. That's where it gets interesting. He tapped a printed screenshot, a photo from a charity gala, dated 6 years back. Luna was in the frame, laughing at something. Standing 2 people to her left, partially cropped, was a man whose jawline matched Dwayne Sloan's current photos closely enough to matter. 6 years. We'd been married 8 years at that point. Caleb had been 7. Aurora had been 3.
6 years. This man had been sitting at their dinner table for 6 years. Think about that for a second.
I picked up the photo and looked at it for a long time. Then I set it down and said, "Keep going. I want everything." Pollard gave a short nod. "There's one more thing you should know now." He slid another page across. "Sloan has done this before. Different woman, different city, Memphis, 4 years ago. Married, well off, ran in philanthropic circles. The husband eventually figured it out, but by then a significant amount had moved through similar channels. No charges were ever filed. It settled quietly. A professional. The man wasn't just Luna's mistake. He was a calculated operator who found vulnerable entry points in marriages and worked them for money. I closed the folder and handed it back. "Keep a copy of everything. I'll need it documented." "Already done," Pollard said. I left his office and sat in my truck in the parking lot for a while. Not falling apart. I want to be clear about that. I was angry, yes, but it was the clean, focused kind of angry that sharpens you instead of blurring you. My father's letter had said, "Find out everything before you say anything." I was finding out, and every layer was worse than the one before it. That evening I called my attorney, a family law specialist named Patricia Horn, who came with a quiet reputation for being devastating in court. I gave her Pollard's preliminary findings. She listened, asked 4 precise questions, and told me to have Pollard continue documenting and to make no changes to my financial behavior yet. "Don't move money," she said. "Don't change accounts. Don't give her any reason to think you know." "Understood." And, "Mr. Harrington, start keeping a personal log. Dates, observations, anything out of the ordinary. Handwritten, not on your phone." I stopped at a drugstore on the way home and bought a small notebook. That night, after the kids were asleep and Luna was watching something in the living room, I sat at my desk and wrote the first entry. 2 weeks passed. I went to work, came home, ate dinner with my family, helped Aurora with her homework, talked to Caleb about his basketball tryouts. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything had. Pollard had continued digging. The transfers from our joint account totaled just over $19,000 across 20 months. $19,000 that had moved from my paycheck into Dwayne Sloan's orbit while I was sitting in client meetings and picking up dry cleaning. Patricia Horn was building the legal framework quietly. She'd flagged the financial transfers as potential marital waste, a term that, she explained with characteristic flatness, carried real weight in Tennessee family court. But I needed one more thing. I needed proof that Luna was actively coordinating with Sloan, not just seeing him. The financial trail was strong, but a determined attorney could argue coincidence, could argue that Luna had simply been defrauded by a man she trusted professionally. I needed to show intent, coordination, conspiracy, if we're using the right word. Grant had suggested the idea over coffee the previous week, half joking when he said it. But I turned it over for days and decided it was exactly right. I chose a Tuesday morning. Luna was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, and I made sure to seem distracted, a little stressed, not unusual for me before a big pitch. I poured coffee and said, almost offhandedly, I've got a meeting Thursday with the Meridian partners. They're finally moving on the Atlanta expansion. I'll probably be tied up all day and might stay over. Luna looked up from her phone. Thursday. Yeah, might not be back until Friday morning. I shrugged. Big deal if it goes through. She nodded. Okay, I'll figure out the kids. I want to work. I told no one at Meridian about any Atlanta meeting because there wasn't one. I called Pollard from my car and told him to watch Sloan starting Wednesday evening. Thursday morning, I drove to Grant's place instead of the office and worked from his kitchen table. At 11:14 a.m., Pollard sent me a text. He's at your house. Arrived 10:52. Car parked 2 streets over. At 12:30 p.m., still inside. At 2:17 p.m., leaving now. Photos attached. I opened the photos. Dwayne Sloan walking out my front door, Luna visible in the doorway behind him. Not touching. Careful enough for that. But his posture, her expression, the unhurried ease of the whole thing told the story clearly enough. Pollard had also captured something I hadn't anticipated. As Sloan reached the sidewalk, he turned back and Luna handed him a folded piece of paper. An envelope. What's an envelope? I texted. Pollard replied 20 minutes later. Followed him to a coffee shop on 12th. He opened it at the table. Photographed contents from adjacent seat. Scanning and sending now. The scan came through a few minutes later. Inside the envelope was a single handwritten note in Luna's handwriting and a personal check from her studio account for $1,000. I sat in Grant's kitchen and stared at it. You got her, Grant said quietly from across the table. He'd been reading the updates over my shoulder. Yeah, I said. I set the phone down and picked up my coffee. Now I need to figure out exactly when to use it. I'd known Raymond Hicks by reputation for 3 years before I ever sat across from him in a room. He ran Apex Creative Group, a mid-sized media and branding firm based in Brentwood, about 20 minutes from Meridian's offices. We'd competed for the same clients more than once, and we'd each won and lost our share. I knew him as aggressive, methodical, and not particularly interested in pleasantries. He was 50 years old, had built his company from a 2-person shop, and was widely considered to be the sharpest operator in the Nashville media market outside of the big national players. We were not friends. We were not enemies. We were competitors who had never needed to be anything else. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November. Grant had tipped me off the week before. He'd heard through a mutual contact in the industry that Hicks was dealing with something personal that had intersected with his business, something involving a consultant who had gotten closer to his firm than he'd intended. Grant didn't have details, but he had a hunch. I called Raymond Hicks directly. No intermediary, no pretext. I told him I had information about a man named Dwayne Sloan and that I suspected we had a common problem. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "When can you meet?" We sat in a corner booth at a restaurant in Green Hills with no one nearby. Hicks arrived before me and already had coffee. He was a compact man with a direct gaze and no wasted movement. He spoke first. Sloan approached me 8 months ago, presented himself as a brand strategy consultant with an impressive client list. I did surface-level due diligence. His references checked out. His LinkedIn was polished. I brought him in on a project basis. He paused, turning his cup once. 3 months later, I found out 2 things simultaneously. 1, his credentials were fabricated. The licenses, the prior clients, the portfolio, all constructed. 2, He had developed a personal relationship with someone inside my firm, someone with access to client contracts and pricing structures. I kept my expression neutral. Did he take anything? Nothing I can prove in court. But 2 clients left within 60 days of his departure from the project. Went to a competitor whose pitch was suspiciously close to our internal strategy documents. Hicks looked at me steadily. He's not a romantic opportunist, Mr. Harrington. He's an information broker. The personal relationships are the method. The money and the intelligence are the product. I told him what Pollard had found. The 20 months of transfers. The prior situation in Memphis. The photo from 6 years back at the charity gala. Hicks listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So he's been working your wife for 6 years. At minimum. And you have documentation of the financial transfers." "My PI has it. My attorney has it." Hicks nodded slowly. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a USB drive on the table between us. "I have something that might be useful to you. Communications between Sloan and my former contact inside Apex. Emails, mostly. They establish a clear pattern of how he operates, how he identifies targets, how he builds the relationship, how he structures the financial arrangements." He slid the drive toward me. "I can't use it publicly without exposing my own firm's vulnerability. But you can use it to establish who he is. And what he did to your marriage wasn't personal. It was professional." I picked up the drive. "Why are you helping me?" Hicks picked up his coffee. "Because Sloan cost me 2 clients and 6 months of sleep. And because men like him keep operating as long as nobody puts the full picture together." He met my eyes. "Put the full picture together, Mr. Harrington." I drove back to Pollard's office and handed him the drive. He had a read on it within the hour. The communications confirmed everything Hicks had described. A methodology. A playbook. Dwayne Sloan had used it on at least 4 women across 3 cities that they could identify, and Luna wasn't his first long-term operation. She was just the current one. That evening I sat at my desk after the kids were asleep and added 3 pages to my notebook. Dates, amounts, names, the shape of the whole thing, laid out in order. Luna walked past the office door around 9:30 and stopped when she saw the light on. "Working late. Wrapping something up," I said, without looking up from the page. She stood there a second, then moved on. I heard her close the bedroom door. I kept writing. The call from Dr. Renata Shields came on a Thursday morning while I was driving to the office. Dr. Shields was the children's therapist. We'd started taking Caleb to her 8 months ago when his grades slipped and he'd gotten into 2 fights at school. She'd been good for him, straightforward and no nonsense. Aurora had started seeing her monthly as a precaution, which Luna had suggested and I'd agreed to without question. I answered on the second ring. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "I want to be transparent with you about something. And I want to stress that this call is being made with the same transparency to both parents. I've been made aware that Mrs. Harrington has had several conversations with me over the past month that have included characterizations of your parenting and home environment that I believe you should know about." I pulled into a parking lot and stopped the car. "What kind of characterizations?" Dr. Shields chose her words carefully. "Descriptions of emotional unavailability. Suggestions that the home atmosphere has been tense due to your behavior. Claims that the children have expressed concerns to her that they haven't expressed to me." A pause. "I want to be clear. In my sessions with Caleb and Aurora, neither child has indicated anything that aligns with what Mrs. Harrington has described. Children don't always say everything to a therapist, but the disconnect here is significant enough that I felt obligated to raise it with you directly." I kept my voice even. "I appreciate that, Dr. Shields. I'd also like to suggest, going forward, that any communications from either parent regarding the children's therapeutic progress go through both parents simultaneously. I should have established that boundary earlier. I'm establishing it now." "That sounds right to me," I said. After I hung up, I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. Luna had been working on the therapist, quietly, steadily, building a picture of me as the problem in the house, probably for months. It was well executed, I'll give her that. If Dr. Shields had been less scrupulous, it might have worked.
She used their own children's therapist against him. That's not just betrayal anymore. That's a whole different level of cold.
I called Patricia Horn from the parking lot. She listened to the summary and was quiet for a moment. "She's building a custody narrative," Patricia said. "This is consistent with what we'd expect, if she's been consulting her own attorney on the side. The therapist angle is common. You try to establish a professional record of parental deficiency before the divorce proceedings begin. Her voice was steady and precise. The fact that the therapist called you is significant. That call, properly documented, becomes evidence of the attempt itself. How do I document it? Follow up with Dr. Shields in writing today. Email. Ask her to confirm what she told you. Keep it factual, no editorializing. She'll likely respond, and that response becomes part of your file. Patricia paused. And, Mr. Harrington, I'd recommend switching to a different therapist for the children. Someone neither of you has a prior relationship with. A clean slate. I spent my lunch hour on that. Found a well-reviewed child psychologist on the West Side. Made appointments for both kids for the following week, and sent Dr. Shields a careful, professional email summarizing our conversation. Her reply came before the end of the day, measured, professional, and clearly written by someone who understood it might eventually be read by a judge. I printed it and added it to the file. That evening, Grant came over after dinner. We sat on the back porch while the kids watched a movie inside, and I walked him through the week. Raymond Hicks, the USB drive, the therapist. Grant was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he shook his head slowly. She had a three-front strategy going. The money, the man, and the narrative. Yeah. And she thought you were too busy to notice any of it. I looked out the backyard. The old swing set Caleb had outgrown, but Aurora still used sometimes. She knew exactly what I cared about, I said. She just miscalculated what I'd do when I found out. Grant looked at me. What are you going to do? I turned the coffee cup in my hands. Everything Patricia tells me to. In exactly the order she tells me to do it. He nodded once. Patricia Horn called me on a Monday morning and said 4 words. We're ready to move. I've been waiting for those words for 3 weeks. Everything Pollard had gathered, everything Raymond Hicks had handed me on that USB drive, the trap I'd set and Luna had walked straight into. It was all documented, organized, and sitting in a file at Patricia's office that was thick enough to double as a doorstop. We filed that afternoon. Divorce petition, custody motion, and a separate filing flagging the financial transfers as marital waste. Patricia had timed it precisely, served before Luna could retain her own attorney, which meant she'd be scrambling to find representation while we were already 2 moves ahead. I was at the office when the process server went to the house. Grant called me 10 minutes later. She called me, he said. Didn't know who else to call. She sounded like she'd been hit by a bus. What did she say? That you blindsided her. That she didn't understand why you couldn't just talk to her. Grant's voice was dry. I told her you tried talking in the bathroom 3 weeks ago, and she'd answered with a made-up story about a client. How'd she take that? She hung up. Luna called me twice that afternoon. I let both calls go to voicemail. Patricia had been clear. No direct communication outside of documented channels. I texted Luna a single line, all communication through attorneys going forward, and left it at that. The next day, she showed up at Meridian. I found out from our front desk that she'd arrived unannounced, asked to see me, and been told I was in a meeting. She'd waited 20 minutes in the lobby, then left. I heard about it secondhand. The meeting she'd interrupted was real, a client call that had nothing to do with any of this. But the optics of her showing up at my workplace uninvited were exactly the kind of thing Patricia had told me to document. I wrote it down that evening, time and date, and added it to the file. 3 days later, she retained an attorney. His name was Preston Voss. I recognized it. A downtown family law firm with a reputation for aggressive tactics and media-friendly posturing. Patricia wasn't concerned. Voss plays to the gallery, she told me. He makes noise and hopes the other side flinches. We won't. The first real shot came the following Tuesday, when Voss filed a countermotion alleging financial misconduct on my part. Specifically, he claimed I had made unauthorized transfers from the joint account to fund what he described as undisclosed personal expenditures, and that I had been deliberately reducing household financial resources in anticipation of litigation. It was fabricated. Every dollar in our accounts was accounted for, every transfer documented and legitimate. But that wasn't the point. The point was to muddy the water, to make me look like I was hiding something, so that Luna's $19,000 in transfers to Dwayne Sloan Shell Company would look like just one side of a mutual problem. I sat in Patricia's conference room and listened to her walk through Voss's filing without raising my voice once. He's guessing, she said, setting the document down. He doesn't have anything. If he had anything, he'd have led with it. She looked at me. We respond with your complete financial records going back 3 years. Clean, organized, annotated. We bury his allegation under documentation. Do it, I said. Pollard had one more piece he'd been working on for 2 weeks, the Memphis situation. The previous husband who'd dealt with Sloan and settled quietly. Pollard had tracked him down through court records and made a discreet call. The man's name was Gerald Whitfield, and he'd agreed to provide a written statement confirming the pattern he'd experienced, the fabricated credentials, the financial arrangement, the way Sloan had operated. I read Whitfield's statement that evening at my desk. It was a plain, careful document, dates, amounts, a description of how it had ended. At the bottom, he'd written one line that wasn't part of the legal summary. I hope you hit him harder than I did. I intended to. Aurora brought me a drawing before bed that night. 2 stick figures holding hands, labeled Dad and Rora in her careful printing. I taped it to the edge of my desk lamp and looked at it for a while after she was asleep. Whatever happened in that courtroom, these 2 kids were coming home with me. That was the only outcome I was building toward. The Meridian Quarterly Gala was held every November at a hotel downtown. Clients, partners, industry contacts, the usual rotation of faces. Luna and I had attended together every year since I joined the company. This year I went alone. I didn't announce it. I didn't make a thing of it. I simply arrived, signed in, and moved through the room the way I always had. Handshakes, conversations, a drink I barely touched. But people noticed. In our industry, in our circle, absence speaks loudly. In the absence of Luna Harrington standing beside me at the Meridian Gala, 2 weeks after divorce filings had apparently started making quiet rounds through the Nashville professional network, spoke at a particular volume. Raymond Hicks found me near the bar around 8:30. "You look like a man who slept well last night," he said, which was his version of a compliment. I did. I told him, and it was true. He held his glass without drinking from it. Voss filed a counter-motion. "Patricia told me. She's not worried. She's right not to be." Hicks glanced across the room, then back at me. "For what it's worth, the Whitfield statement is going to matter. A documented pattern changes the conversation from marital dispute to predatory scheme. Judges notice that distinction. That's what Patricia thinks too." He nodded once. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, which would have been unthinkable 3 weeks ago. "You know," Hicks said eventually, "I've competed against you for 3 years and never once thought about whether I respected you." A pause. "I do, for the record." I looked at him. Same. He moved on. I stayed where I was for a minute, watching the room. A year ago, I would have been scanning it for Luna, checking that she was comfortable, making sure we were working the room the way couples do at industry events. Now I was just here, present for my own purposes, on my own terms. It was a different feeling than I'd expected. Not lonely, not triumphant, just clean. Patricia called me the next morning with news I hadn't anticipated. Voss had reached out to her the previous evening, after the gala, as if my appearing there alone had been a signal of some kind. He wanted to discuss a settlement framework. No litigation, no trial, a negotiated resolution. "She's scared," Patricia said. "Of what specifically?" "The financial evidence. Voss has seen Pollard's report now, the full version I disclosed in response to his countermotion. He knows about the Whitfield statement. He knows about Hicks and the USB drive." A brief pause. His client didn't tell him everything before he took the case. "He's recalibrating." "What does settlement look like?" I asked. "She's proposing joint custody, a 50-50 asset split, and no spousal support either direction." I didn't answer immediately. I walked to the window of my office and looked out at the street below. Joint custody meant my kids going back and forth for the rest of their school years. It meant Caleb and Aurora spending nights in a house that Dwayne Sloan had access to, with a woman who had been running a financial arrangement with him for 20 months while I paid the mortgage. "No," I said. "Full physical custody, primary legal custody, structured visitation. She can see them. I'm not trying to cut her out of their lives. But they come home to me." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That's a harder line to hold in court, absent evidence of direct harm to the children." "I have the therapist documentation," I said. "She tried to manipulate the children's therapist to build a custody narrative. That's in the file." "It is," Patricia acknowledged. "All right, I'll respond accordingly." Her voice shifted slightly, something approaching approval. "Mr. Harrington, I want you to know, In 20 years of family law, the clients who come to me with this level of documentation are the ones who determine the outcome. You've done the work. I thanked her and hung up. That evening, I took Caleb and Aurora to their favorite pizza place on Charlotte Avenue. Caleb ate 3 slices and complained that his basketball coach was running extra conditioning drills before tryouts. Aurora declared that mushrooms were the best topping and that anyone who disagreed was wrong. I ate my own food and watched them and thought about nothing except what was right in front of me. On the drive home, Aurora fell asleep in the back seat. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, without looking at me, "Dad, is stuff with you and Mom going to be okay?" I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. 13 years old, trying to ask a big question in the smallest possible voice. "It's going to be different," I said carefully. "But you and Aurora are always going to be okay. That's the part that matters." He nodded and looked back out the window. He didn't ask anything else. Sometimes that's enough. Not all the answers, just the right one at the right moment. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a minute after Aurora stirred awake. The house was lit up, warm looking from outside. Whatever happened in the next few weeks, this was still ours. And I wasn't giving it up without a fight I'd already won. The settlement conference happened on a Tuesday morning in early December, in a rented conference room and neutral law firm on 2nd Avenue. Patricia had chosen the location deliberately. No home turf, no history, no advantage to either side walking in the door. I arrived 10 minutes early. Luna and Preston Voss arrived together, 3 minutes late, which told me Voss had coached her on optics. She looked composed. Good suit, careful makeup, the kind of presentation that takes effort to make look effortless. I recognized it because I'd watched her assemble it in our bathroom mirror for 14 years. She glanced at me when she sat down. I looked back without expression and turned to Patricia. Voss opened with their position: joint custody, equal asset split, no acknowledgement of the financial transfers as marital waste. He framed it as a straightforward dissolution of a marriage that had run its course. Calm language, reasonable tone. The kind of pitch you make when you know the other side has the cards and you're hoping they'll settle for optics. Patricia let him finish. Then she opened her folder. In the next 40 minutes, she laid out everything. Pollard's full financial report, the account numbers, the transfer timeline, the shell company registration, the connection to Dwayne Sloan's LLC, the fabricated Thursday meeting and Luna's delivery of the envelope to Sloan on camera, Raymond Hicks' USB drive and its contents establishing Sloan's methodology across multiple targets, Gerald Whitfield's written statement from Memphis, the children's therapist documentation, Dr. Shields' email confirming the attempt to build a custody narrative and her subsequent withdrawal from those conversations. Voss had known about some of it, not all of it. I watched him read the Whitfield statement and then set it down with the particular stillness of a man recalculating. Luna's composure held through the financial section. It faltered, just slightly, when Patricia read from the USB drive communications, the passages where Sloan had categorized his targets, described his methods, noted the duration and financial yield of each arrangement. Luna's name wasn't in those files, but the pattern was identical. Voss put a hand on her arm, and she pulled it away. Our position, Patricia said, closing the folder, is primary physical custody to Mr. Harrington. Structured visitation for Mrs. Harrington, reviewed every 90 days. The family home goes to Mr. Harrington. The investment portfolio, roughly equivalent in value, goes to Mrs. Harrington. The transfer total of $19,400 is treated as marital waste and offset against her share. Silence. Voss leaned toward Luna and spoke quietly. She shook her head twice. He spoke again. She looked at the table for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "The kids," she said, and her voice was the first unguarded thing I'd heard from her in weeks. "I want to see the kids." "You can," I said. "Every other weekend to start. Room to expand if the parenting coordinator agrees." Her throat moved. "That's not enough." "It's what's available right now," I replied. "You spent the last 6 weeks trying to build a case that I was an inadequate father through your children's therapist. The parenting coordinator will factor that in. Show her something different over the next 6 months, and the schedule changes." She looked down again. Voss wrote something on his notepad. They exchanged a look. Then he nodded once, slowly, and began discussing the language with Patricia. It took another 2 hours to finalize the details. When it was done and the signatures were gathered, Voss packed his briefcase quickly and left. Luna stood at the end of the table for a moment, buttoning her coat. I was already talking quietly with Patricia. Luna didn't say anything on her way out. At the door she paused, and I thought she might turn around. She didn't. Patricia walked me to my car afterward. "Clean," she said simply. "Thank you," I told her. "You did the preparation," she replied. "I just presented it." I drove home in the early afternoon light. Caleb and Aurora were still at school. The house on Elmwood Drive was quiet. The good kind of quiet this time, not the wrong kind. I walked through the kitchen, down the hallway, to the master bedroom. The bathroom door was standing open the way I'd gotten used to leaving it. I stood in the doorway and looked at the sink where the razor had been, the spot where a stranger's toothbrush had sat beside mine, the towel rack where a damp towel had told a story Luna hadn't been ready to explain. I'd stood in this exact spot 7 weeks ago and felt the floor shift under me. I stood here now and felt something else. Not relief, not victory, just the particular solidity of a man who didn't let the ground stay unsteady. I went to the kitchen and started dinner before the kids got home. 8 months later, Caleb made the basketball team. He texted me from the gym with a string of capital letters that required no translation. I was in a client meeting when it came through, and I excused myself for 60 seconds to type back. "I knew you would. Dinner tonight, your choice." He chose the burger place on Broadway. Aurora demanded onion rings as a side and ate most of Caleb's. Life had rearranged itself into something I hadn't planned for, but it started to recognize as mine. The house on Elmwood was ours, the 3 of us, in a way it had never quite been when there were 4. That sounded like a loss, and in some ways it was. But it was also the truest version of the place it had ever been. Dwayne Sloan's story had a postscript. Patricia had forwarded me a brief summary in March. A civil judgment entered against him in Tennessee court, stemming from a consolidated complaint that included my case, the Memphis matter from Whitfield, and a third situation out of Knoxville that Pollard had uncovered during the broader investigation. Sloan hadn't contested any of it. His Tennessee LLCs were dissolved. He'd apparently relocated to somewhere outside the state with significantly fewer resources than he'd arrived with. Raymond Hicks and I had lunch twice since November. We'd referred one client to each other. Neither of us had become warm exactly, but we'd become something more useful. 2 people who understood each other and had proven it under pressure. That was its own kind of relationship. Luna saw the kids on alternating weekends. The schedule had held. The parenting coordinator's review in April had gone straightforwardly. Nothing to expand, nothing to reduce. Caleb dealt with it in his quiet, head-down way. Aurora asked questions sometimes, the kind 9-year-olds ask when they're trying to map a world that's changed. I answered them as honestly as I could without making her carry more than she should. Grant and I had coffee every other Thursday. He'd started dating someone, a woman he'd met at an industry event, and he seemed lighter for it. He asked me once, carefully, whether I was thinking about moving on. I gave a straight answer. Not yet. Maybe eventually. But not because I'm looking for something to fill a gap. He nodded like that made sense to him. On a Saturday in late July, I was doing the kind of weekend maintenance that houses demand. Fixing a cabinet hinge, replacing a bulb in the hallway, and I ended up in a master bathroom with a toolbox, recaulking the edge of the sink where the old seal had started to lift. I worked through it methodically, the way my father would have. No rush, each step done properly before moving to the next. The bathroom had been repainted in the spring, new towels, small changes that added up to something different. It didn't look like the room where everything had broken open. It looked like a room that had been remade. I finished the caulk line, cleaned up the tools, and stood back to check the work. The sink was clean and even. The mirror showed a man in weekend clothes with a toolbox, looking at what he'd fixed. Nothing dramatic, just a job done right. Aurora appeared in the doorway behind me, holding a book. "Dad, are you almost done?" Caleb said we could go to the park. "Give me 2 minutes," I told her. She disappeared down the hall. I put the tools away, washed my hands, and took one last look at the room. Not with weight, not with the memory of that October evening pressing down on it. Just a room in my house where I'd fixed something that needed fixing. Then I dried my hands, grabbed my keys, and went to take my kids to the park.
Well, I think some men fall apart when everything breaks. This man didn't. He got quiet, got smart, and rebuilt everything on his own terms. That's the kind of story I think we all need to hear sometimes. Thanks for listening and see you in the next video.